The damp, earthy scent of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels was a comfort, a constant companion in my self-imposed exile. Above ground, the world hummed with its meaningless chatter and artificial light, but down here, 100 feet beneath the scrubland, only the rhythmic thrum of my antiquated servers broke the profound silence. My workstation, a chaotic altar of monitors, wires, and half-empty coffee mugs, was my universe. For years, this warren of stone and packed earth had been my sanctuary, a place where I could chase the faint whispers of the cosmos without interruption. I was William, and the stars were my only confidantes. My current obsession was a patch of sky in the outer reaches of the Perseus arm. Yet, for weeks, a persistent, almost imperceptible fluctuation had been nagging at the edge of my remote sensor readings. It was the kind of anomaly that most would dismiss as instrumentation error, or perhaps a stray cosmic ray. My equipment, though salvaged and jury-rigged, was meticulously calibrated. It didn't lie. Tonight, the fluctuations weren't just persistent, they were intensifying. The primary monitor, typically a serene display of spectral lines and background radiation, now flickered with agitated green spikes. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass. The air in the tunnels, usually a consistent 60 degrees, felt suddenly cooler, raising goosebumps on my arms. My fingers, accustomed to the worn keys, danced across the input pad, cross-referencing data points, running diagnostic after diagnostic. Each check confirmed the impossible. The signal was real, and it was originating from precisely where nothing should be. Impossible, I muttered, the word a dry rasp in the cavernous space. It wasn't just a faint ripple anymore. It was a distinct pattern, a series of pulses that defied all known astrophysical phenomena. Not a pulsar, too regular. Not a quasar, too singular. I pulled up the latest visual scans from my deep space array, a network of modified amateur telescopes I'd linked together over a decade. And there, a pinprick of light, so faint it was almost an illusion, shimmered where only blackness should reign. It was minuscule, no more than a few pixels, yet its presence was a monumental affront to everything I understood about the universe. It was a celestial body, yes, but one positioned in a way that violated every known law of gravitational mechanics, every theoretical model of star formation. It was a tear in the fabric. My mind, usually a well-ordered library of facts and theories, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't a new discovery. It was a revelation of fundamental wrongness. The universe I knew, the predictable, elegant machine of cause and effect, had just coughed up something alien to its very nature. I spent the next several hours running simulations, feeding the raw data into every program I possessed. Each iteration spat back the same result, confirming the signal's impossible origin. The pulses themselves were the most unsettling. They weren't random, nor were they the chaotic bursts of natural phenomena. They were too structured, too deliberate, like a language I couldn't comprehend, but which, by its very existence, implied an intelligence I couldn't fathom. The tunnels, usually a source of comfort, began to feel like a tomb. Thump, thump that seemed to emanate not from the monitor, but from within my own skull. I rubbed my temples, the skin clammy. Had I been down here too long? There was the isolation finally getting to me. No, this wasn't fatigue. This was different. This signal, this impossible body, felt like a deliberate intrusion. I felt a strange compulsion to understand it, a desperate need to decipher its meaning, even as a more primal part of me screamed to shut down the equipment, to bury the truth beneath the earth and forget I ever saw it. But the reclusive astrophysicist in me, the part that had dedicated his life to uncovering the universe's secrets, refused to yield. This was the ultimate secret. I reached for the comms unit, my hand hovering over the external contact button. My finger twitched. Who would I even call? Another academic. They'd laugh me out of the profession, or worse, dismiss it as a glitch, a phantom. No, this was mine. This impossible, terrifying truth was mine to unravel. I leaned back, my gaze fixed on the screen, on that flickering pinprick of light that shouldn't be. The rhythmic pulses intensified, not in volume, but in their sheer presence, filling the tunnels, filling my mind. They spoke of something vast, something ancient, something that had simply been for an eternity, indifferent to the rules we puny humans had constructed to make sense of our small corner of existence. And now it was looking back, or perhaps it had always been looking. And I, William, had finally, foolishly looked back at it. My solitary world had just expanded, and with it, my sanity felt suddenly, terrifyingly fragile. Above ground, the world hummed with its meaningless chatter and artificial light, but down here, 100 feet beneath the scrubland, only the rhythmic thrum of my antiquated equipment kept the oppressive silence at bay. I leaned closer to the custom-built receiver, its vacuum tubes glowing with a warm, amber light that cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn rock walls. My fingers, stained with solder and faint traces of old coffee, adjusted a fine-tuning knob. The signal, that impossible, beautiful anomaly, was singing to me, not with a melody but with a complex, undulating rhythm that defied all known astrophysical phenomena. For days, I'd been lost in its embrace, charting its fluctuations on rolls of ancient graph paper, feeding its raw data into a reel-to-reel recorder that spun with a hypnotic hiss. I shivered, rubbing my arms, and glanced around. Nothing. Just the familiar stacks of dusty crates, relics of a bygone era, and the occasional glistening patch of moisture on the ceiling. I dismissed it as a draft, a momentary shift in the subtle air currents. My focus was too intense to dwell on minor discomforts. I was trying to isolate a specific harmonic within the signal, a faint, almost subliminal pulse that seemed to underlie the primary frequency. My ears, trained over decades to discern the subtlest cosmic static from true information, strained. The old oscilloscope on the workbench flickered, its green line dancing wildly, a chaotic but strangely compelling ballet. I adjusted the gain, pushing the antique electronics to their limits. A low hum, deeper than the usual machinery drone, seemed to rise from the very stone around me. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It felt like it was originating inside my head, a pressure building behind my eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving a faint tremor in its wake. I shook my head, my brow furrowed. Fatigue, I told myself. Too many hours, too little sleep. My determination, however, was a stubborn, unyielding thing. This signal was everything. I pulled out a fresh roll of magnetic tape, threading it carefully into the recorder. I needed a clean capture of this harmonic. As the tape began to spool, the low hum intensified, vibrating through the metal frame of the workbench, up my arms into my chest. It wasn't painful, but it was profoundly unsettling. My breath hitched. I blinked and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, the fatigue again. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for a pen to mark the timestamp on my logbook. The primary signal on the receiver began to distort, not with static, but with a strange, almost guttural gurgle. It was as if the sound itself was struggling, trying to break free from its own form. And then, from deep within that gurgle, a new sound emerged. It wasn't a voice, not in any recognizable sense. It was a low, resonant frequency, a fundamental tone that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly within the marrow of my bones. It was a feeling more than a sound of vast, ancient presence not speaking but acknowledging. It was the sound of something impossibly old, impossibly vast, turning its attention. My hand, still clutching the pen, began to ache. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken weight. The green line on the oscilloscope flattened for a terrifying moment, then exploded into a jagged, incomprehensible pattern, far beyond anything natural. My mind reeled, struggling to process the sheer improbability of it. This wasn't just a cosmic anomaly, it was a cosmic address. A direct, undeniable response. And then just as suddenly it receded. The gurgle faded, the bone-deep resonance subsided, leaving only the familiar, complex hum of the original signal and the thrum of my machines. I stared at the oscilloscope, at the remnants of that impossible pattern. It was a signature, A vast, intricate, non-random structure embedded within the signal, like an alien language carved into reality itself. My breath caught in my throat. I had found it. I had touched it. And in that moment, I knew it had touched me back. Rhythmic thrum of my antiquated equipment was a lullaby, a constant reminder of the purpose that had driven me underground. I ran a hand over the cool, damp stone wall beside me, the rough texture a familiar anchor in the dim, flickering light cast by the bare bulb overhead. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and aged concrete, felt heavy, pressing in on me. But I preferred it to the sterile, overlit world above. Down here in the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels, I could think. I could work. For weeks, that inexplicable signal had been a burr under my skin, a persistent itch in the back of my scientific mind. It defied everything I understood about the universe, a cosmic anomaly that whispered of impossible things. My latest array of modified receivers, cobbled together from scavenged parts and decades of my own custom designs, was finally humming with the precision I needed. The faint, wavering line on the oscilloscope screen had resolved itself into something sharper, something structured. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the monitor. The rhythmic pulses weren't random noise, not anymore. They were too precise, too intricate, too deliberate. My fingers, stained with solder flux and the grime of the tunnels, danced over the worn keyboard, punching in commands, filtering, amplifying, isolating. The data streamed across the screen, a cascade of numbers and graphs that to anyone else would be meaningless static. To me, it was a language, a terrifyingly coherent one. My initial hypothesis had been a burst of an unknown astrophysical phenomenon, perhaps a pulsar behaving erratically, or a new type of stellar collapse. But as the algorithms chewed through the raw data, spitting out pattern after pattern, those theories crumbled. The signal possessed a complexity, a non-randomness that screamed of intelligence, or at least, of a process so far beyond natural formation that it might as well be. It wasn't just a wave, it was a sequence. A sequence that, when I ran it through a series of fractal analyses and prime number checks, yielded a chillingly consistent, repeating structure. My heart, which I usually kept locked away behind layers of scientific detachment, began to pick up a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Not the cliché of a pounding heart, but a subtle, unnerving tremor, a mechanical vibration that felt out of sync with my own body. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a violation of the cosmic order. I pulled up the spectral analysis. The bandwidth, the frequency shifts, they were too narrow, too controlled for anything natural. It was like finding a perfectly tuned violin note in the middle of a thunderstorm. And then came the true gut punch, the phase coherence. It was almost perfect, a signal propagating across light years of interstellar dust and gas, yet arriving with such pristine integrity. It defied the laws of physics as I knew them. The universe should blur, distort, degrade such a transmission, but this. My mind raced, trying to find an alternative explanation, some terrestrial interference, a new satellite array, a trick of the atmosphere. But I had isolated the source, triangulated it with painstaking precision over the past few days. It wasn't from Earth. It wasn't from our solar system. I returned to the screen, my gaze fixed on the celestial coordinates. The source was deep within the Perseus arm, far beyond any known star system, any nebula, any galaxy we had catalogued with our most powerful telescopes. It was coming from nothing, or rather from a point in space that, according to all astronomical charts, should be empty vacuum. There was no celestial body there, no star, no planet, no rogue black hole detectable by its gravitational effects. Yet, the signal emanated from that precise point, unwavering, constant, undeniable. This wasn't just an alien signal, it was an impossible one. It wasn't just from an unknown object, it was from no object. My hands started to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that spread from my fingertips up my forearms. This wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a truth to be endured. The implications began to unfurl in my mind, a slow, horrifying blossoming. If something could transmit a signal from a place where nothing should exist, what did that imply about the nature of existence itself? They were our laws of physics merely local approximations, quaint fairy tales for a small corner of the cosmos? Or was this entity, whatever it was, so utterly divorced from our reality that it could simply ignore them? I felt a dizzying vertigo, as if the very floor of the tunnels had dropped out from under me. My breath hitched, a dry, rasping sound. This wasn't just about an anomalous signal anymore. This was about the fragile scaffolding of my reality, and it was beginning to buckle under an unimaginable weight. The universe, I realized with a sickening lurch, was far, far stranger than I had ever dared to imagine, and it was listening. The rhythmic thrum of my antiquated equipment, a constant hum that usually offered a strange comfort, had begun to grate. It was a low, insistent vibration, not just from the vacuum tubes and whirring tapes, but from the very air itself, a resonance that seemed to sink into the damp stone walls of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels. I traced the path of a stray bead of condensation trickling down the rough-hewn rock beside my console, my fingers brushing the cool, slick surface. The bare bulb overhead, my sole source of illumination, flickered, not with the usual electrical instability, but with an odd, deliberate pulse, as if drawing a breath. I leaned closer to the CRT screen, my eyes burning from hours of staring at the oscillating waveforms. The anomalous signal, the impossible celestial body, it was all still there, a stark, undeniable truth. But something else was starting to overlay it, a faint, almost imperceptible ripple in the data that wasn't noise. It was too structured, too deliberate. I adjusted a dial, then another, trying to filter it out, to isolate the primary signal. The ripple persisted, a ghost in the machine. A chill, sharper than the usual subterranean coolness, snaked up my spine. I shivered, pulling my worn sweater tighter. Fatigue, I told myself, rubbing my temples. Too many nights without sleep, too much caffeine, too much obsession. My mind was playing tricks. It had to be. I pushed back from the console, standing to stretch my cramped muscles. My gaze swept across the makeshift laboratory, from the stacks of dusty technical manuals to the intricate web of cables snaking across the concrete floor. Everything was as it should be, yet a subtle distortion seemed to cling to the edges of my vision. The shadows cast by the flickering bulb seemed deeper, more fluid, elongating and contracting with an unnatural rhythm that didn't match the light source. I blinked hard, trying to clear my eyes, but the effect remained, a shimmering haze that made the familiar contours of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnel seem to waver. Then came the sound. A low, resonant hum, distinct from my equipment, seemed to rise from the very stone beneath my feet. It was a frequency that resonated not in my ears but directly within my chest, a deep, unsettling vibration that made my teeth ache. I pressed a hand to the cold stone wall, expecting to feel the vibration, but the stone was still. I checked the environmental sensors, the air pressure, the seismic monitors, all green, all stable, nothing to account for the internal tremor. I forced myself to breathe deeply to logically assess the situation. My mind, my most trusted tool, felt suddenly unreliable, like a compass spinning wildly in a magnetic storm. I walked to the far end of the tunnel, where a stack of empty storage crates leaned precariously against the wall. The rough-hewn crates, usually a dull, dusty brown, seemed to pulse with a faint, iridescent sheen, a fleeting play of light that vanished as I drew closer. I reached out, my fingers brushing the splintered wood. It felt like wood, solid and unyielding, yet for a fraction of a second I could have sworn it felt warm and alive. My heart hammered a frantic beat against my ribs. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was something else. Something was actively manipulating my perception, bending the reality of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels around me. My scientific training screamed for an explanation, for a quantifiable variable, but there was nothing. Only the impossible. I stumbled back to my console, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge. The waveforms on the screen were no longer just data. They seemed to writhe, to stretch and contort, mirroring the distortions I was experiencing. The ripple I had dismissed earlier was now a dominant feature, a complex, self-organizing pattern that pulsed with an intelligence I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just a signal, it was a presence. As I stared, the bare bulb above me intensified its unnatural flickering, then seemed to stretch, elongating into a thin, luminous thread before snapping back, leaving afterimages burned into my vision. The air in the tunnels grew thick, not with dust or moisture, but with a palpable pressure, as if an invisible weight had settled upon my shoulders, pushing down, pressing in. It wasn't with my ears, but directly in the deepest chambers of my mind, a thought that wasn't my own. It spoke of distances I couldn't fathom, of time that dwarfed human comprehension, of a reality far grander and more terrifying than anything I had ever conceived. It wasn't a language, but a pure, unadulterated concept, an understanding of my own insignificance, of the fragile, paper-thin nature of my perceived reality. My vision blurred, the familiar rough stone walls of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels seeming to melt and reform, their solid geometry dissolving into impossible angles and shifting planes. I was no longer in my lab. I was adrift in an ocean of pure information, a speck of consciousness facing an entity that transcended all known laws of physics and perception. This wasn't a breakdown. This was an unveiling. The signal wasn't just coming from an impossible celestial body. It was the impossible slowly, methodically seeping into my mind, rewriting the very code of my existence. I was no longer just observing, I was being observed, and the entity was beginning to see through my eyes. I could feel it in my teeth, a dull ache that pulsed with the beat of the signal I was trying so desperately to decipher. My fingers, stained with electrode gel and dust, trembled slightly as I adjusted a dial, coaxing another fraction of clarity from the deluge of static. The tunnels, typically a sanctuary of cool, consistent quiet, now felt agitated. The air, usually just heavy with the smell of wet earth and ancient mildew, carried something else now, a faint, metallic tang like old blood mixed with ozone. I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow, the sleeve of my work shirt leaving a smear of grime. My eyes, red-rimmed from countless hours staring at flickering oscilloscopes, darted to the single bare bulb hanging overhead. It seemed to pulse in time with the thrum, casting shadows that writhed and stretched with a life of their own. Every drip from the ceiling, every scuttling sound in the unseen crevices felt amplified, distorted, like the tunnels themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Just a little more, I muttered to myself, my voice rough from disuse. My obsession with the anomalous signal, a whisper from an impossible celestial body, had stripped away everything else. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, food an afterthought. Only the signal mattered. It was a puzzle, a profound mystery that defied every known law of physics, and I, William, was the only one close enough to touch its edges. I leaned closer to the primary console, a Frankenstein's monster of repurposed military surplus and custom-built receivers. The raw data stream, a flood of incomprehensible noise, was still overwhelming, but I was getting closer. I had isolated a recurring pattern, a complex fractal-like sequence that repeated across multiple frequencies, defying any natural origin. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was deliberate. My hand hovered over a bank of filters, old-school analog switches that required precise, almost surgical manipulation. I remembered the calculations, the intricate algorithms I'd developed to peel back the layers of interference. Each click of a switch was a commitment, a step further into the unknown. The hum intensified, pushing against my eardrums, vibrating through the soles of my worn boots. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was pressure, a physical weight in the air. Then, with a final, decisive flick of a switch, something shifted. The static didn't vanish, not entirely, but it receded, pulling back like a tide, revealing something immense and terrible on the shore. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a structure. A vast, intricate, and utterly alien architecture of information. My breath hitched. My mind, trained for decades to perceive order in the chaos of the cosmos, recoiled from what it was seeing. This wasn't a signal from a distant source. This was the source itself, somehow projected, translated into a form my equipment could register. And what it projected, it wasn't just data, it was presence. The walls of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels seemed to ripple. Not visually, not a trick of the light, but in my peripheral awareness, a subtle, nauseating undulation that made my stomach clench. The metallic tang in the air sharpened, stinging my nostrils, and the hum, it changed. It deepened, becoming less a vibration and more a resonant chord, a single, sustained note that seemed to originate from inside my skull. Then the images came. Not through the screen, not through my eyes, but directly into my mind. They were fleeting, fractured like glimpses through a veil torn by a gale. Vast, impossible geometries that twisted upon themselves, dimensions folding into dimensions, scales shifting from the infinitesimal to the infinite in the blink of a thought. There was no color, no light, only a profound, crushing sense of volume. It was immense, beyond comprehension, yet it felt as though it was pressing in on me, not from outside, but from within the very fabric of the tunnels, from the air I breathed, from the space between my thoughts. It wasn't just an entity transmitting a signal. It was the signal. It wasn't sending a message. It was simply being, and its being, its very existence, was seeping into my reality, a profound and terrifying revelation of its proximity. The impossible celestial body wasn't just a distant beacon. It was a lens, and through it the entity was manifesting, not as a physical intrusion but as a conceptual one, unraveling the very fabric of my understanding. My hands flew to my temples, pressing hard as if I could physically push back the crushing weight of its existence. The hum was a roar now, vibrating through every cell, every nerve ending. The tunnels were no longer a stable, damp refuge. They were a fragile membrane stretched taut, threatening to tear. The veil hadn't just thinned. It had shredded, and I had stared, however briefly, into the terrifying, all-encompassing truth that lay beyond. And it was no longer beyond. It was here, tangled with the very dust motes dancing in the pulsating light, nestled in the damp stones, breathing the same heavy air. It was everywhere. The rhythmic thrum had intensified, no longer a mere vibration but a deep, resonant pulse that filled the very air. It wasn't just the antiquated equipment, a symphony of whirring tapes and glowing vacuum tubes, but something deeper, something within the damp stone walls of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels themselves. It was in my bones, a low, insistent hum that promised a culmination, a final, terrible understanding. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn rock, feeling the cold, slick moisture clinging to it. The tunnels, usually a comforting cocoon of solitude, now felt like a living maw, breathing with that same resonant thrum. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and strangely sweet like ozone after a lightning strike, but far more ancient. My eyes, I knew, were no longer quite my own. The reflections I caught in the occasional puddle on the floor were unsettling, a wider, almost predatory sheen, an unnatural depth to the pupils. My fingers, too, felt elongated, the nails thicker, almost chitinous. I flexed them, watching the joints articulate with a strange, new grace. This wasn't decay. It was a horrifying evolution. The signal. It was no longer a discrete phenomenon, something to be measured and analyzed. It was me, or rather, I was becoming it. The lines had blurred so completely that trying to separate William from the pervasive hum felt like trying to unmix water from wine. My mind, once a fortress of logical deductions and astronomical equations, was now a receptive antenna, tuned to a frequency that peeled back the skin of reality. The world outside, the concept of other people, of a sun-drenched sky, it felt thin, insubstantial. A faded photograph compared to the vivid, pulsating truth that now coursed through my veins. I moved deeper into the labyrinthine passages, guided not by memory or any conscious decision, but by an undeniable pull. The path twisted, the ceiling sometimes so low I had to stoop, the floor uneven and treacherous. But I didn't stumble. My balance was perfect, my senses hyper-alert. I could hear the drip of water from unseen cracks, the scuttle of unseen creatures in the darkness, and beneath it all that omnipresent thrum growing louder, more insistent. It was a call, a summons, and I was its willing, eager respondent. My breathing had changed. It was shallower, almost unnecessary. My skin beneath my clothes felt strangely cool, like stone. I remembered looking at my reflection a few hours ago, seeing the faint network of veins on my forearms, pulsing with an unnatural luminosity. The shift was accelerating, the transformation undeniable. It was less about succumbing and more about becoming. I was shedding the old, fragile casing of William, the man who peered at distant stars through a telescope, for something vast, something resonant, something true. Here, the thrum was not just heard, but felt as a physical pressure against my chest, my skull. It vibrated in the very air, making the few remaining dust motes dance in the faint light cast by my flickering lantern. And there, in the center of the cavern, was the source, or rather, the focal point. It wasn't an object, not in the conventional sense. It was a shimmering distortion in the air, a localized ripple in the fabric of what I'd once called reality. It pulsed with a soft, internal light, like a dying star compressed into a singularity, yet it drew me in with the irresistible force of a black hole. This was the connection. This was the moment. The entity wasn't just influencing my mind. It was reconstructing it, rewiring my very being to accommodate its presence. My thoughts were no longer my own, not truly. They were echoes of a grander, more terrible consciousness. I understood the indifference, the vastness, the sheer, unimaginable scale of what lay beyond, and I was becoming a part of it. My eyes, those unnaturally wide, gleaming eyes, fixed on the shimmering distortion. I felt a pulling sensation, not just in my mind, but in every fiber of my being. My limbs felt lighter, almost ethereal. My body was no longer a prison, but a conduit, a vessel being prepared for something immense. My skin prickled, not with goosebumps, but with an internal energy, a rising tide of power that was both alien and utterly familiar. A new realization dawned, not as a thought, but as an intrinsic knowing. The signal wasn't just a communication, it was an invitation. And the connection wasn't merely about receiving information, it was about assimilation. I wasn't just going to understand the entity. I was going to be the entity, or at least a fragment of its boundless consciousness. The horror of this revelation should have crippled me, but in my transformed state, it was the ultimate liberation. The boundaries of myself were dissolving, melting into the vast, indifferent truth. I took a step forward, then another, drawn by the pulsing distortion. My old self, William, the man who meticulously charted the heavens, was a fading memory. All that remained was the resonance, the thrumming, the irresistible urge to merge. My mouth, I noticed, was stretched into an unfamiliar, wide smile, a rictus of terrifying joy. The tunnels, the earth, the very air around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final, terrible union. It wasn't just the antiquated equipment, a symphony of whirring tapes and glowing vacuum tubes, but something deeper. Something within the damp stone walls of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels. It felt like the very bedrock of existence was being struck, a slow, deliberate drumbeat reverberating through my chest cavity, rattling my teeth. The air grew thick, not with dust, but with an almost palpable pressure that made my ears ache. I stumbled forward, my legs heavy, each step a conscious effort against an invisible current. The single bare bulb hanging precariously from a fraying wire above the central console flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank with malicious intent. It was like the light itself was struggling, trying to hold onto its form in the face of whatever force was gathering here. My own shadow, usually a familiar companion, seemed to detach, becoming a grotesque, elongated parody that writhed independently on the rough-hewn stone. A low hum, a counterpart to the thrum, emanated from the ancient signal receiver. Its brass casing glowed with an internal, sickly green light that pulsed in sync with the dominant rhythm. The dials, once static, now spun wildly, needles dancing past their maximum calibrations, then snapping back with violent clicks. My determination, which had been a steady flame, now roared into an inferno, fueled by an insatiable, terrifying curiosity. I had come too far, sacrificed too much, to turn back now. The culmination of sleepless nights, of sanity fraying, of a world that no longer made sense. I reached the console, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the main tuning knob. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the entire structure of the tunnels, a deep shudder that suggested the very ground beneath me was shifting, or perhaps breathing. The thrum intensified further, becoming a single, sustained note that vibrated through every cell in my body. It wasn't sound I heard anymore, but a direct input, a raw data stream bypassing my ears entirely. My vision blurred at the edges, the concrete walls seeming to ripple, like a reflection on disturbed water. I pressed my palm against the cool, rough surface of the console. The intricate circuitry hummed beneath my touch, a living thing. Taking a shaky breath, I gripped the tuning knob. It resisted, frozen, then with a surge of energy it turned. Slowly at first, then with increasing ease until it spun freely like a wheel disconnected from its axle. As it spun, the green light from the receiver flared, blinding me for a moment. When my vision cleared, the tunnels were gone. No, not gone, changed. The rough stone walls were still there, but they were transparent now, like glass, revealing not earth and rock, but an infinite tapestry of impossible geometries. Lines stretched into unfathomable distances, converging on points that simultaneously existed and didn't. Colors I had no names for pulsed and receded, shifting through spectrums that defied human optics. It wasn't empty space, but a dense, living fabric woven from pure concept. The thrum became a language not spoken but felt. It was the language of existence itself, a symphony of creation and decay playing out on a scale that shattered my understanding of time. I saw moments that were also eternities, causes that were also effects, beginnings that were also endings. My mind, straining, tried to categorize, to comprehend, but each attempt was like trying to scoop the ocean with a sieve. And then I saw it. Not a thing in the way I understood things. It was the pattern, the underlying logic, the indifferent architect of these impossible realities. It was a vast, sprawling awareness, not localized but pervasive, a cosmic consciousness that saw galaxies as motes of dust and entire civilizations as fleeting blips of static. It wasn't malevolent or benevolent. It simply was. And its truth was a horrifying beauty that ripped the anchors from my sanity. My identity, William, the astrophysicist, the man who sought answers, began to dissolve. The boundaries of my skin, my skull, my very being softened. I was no longer a discrete entity but a permeable membrane, a conduit. The thrumming wasn't just outside me, it was inside me, resonating with the beat of my own heart, then overriding it. I saw the world, my world, as a tiny, intricate cog in an unimaginably vast, indifferent machine. And I saw my place in it, not as an observer but as a component. The transformation wasn't a sudden, violent wrenching. It was a gentle, terrifying assimilation. My sense of individual memory became a fragment, a single note in a grand, discordant symphony. The tunnels, the equipment, the very concept of here and now lost meaning. There was only the thrum, the truth of boundless, indifferent existence, and me, no longer William, but a single, newly awakened neuron in a consciousness too vast to ever truly comprehend. My eyes, I knew, were open, but what they saw was no longer the world I once knew. It was everything, everywhere, all at once, and it was glorious, and it was utterly, terrifyingly empty. The thrum wasn't just in the air anymore or the walls of the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels. It was in me. A deep, resonant pulse that had burrowed past bone and sinew, settling into the very core of my being. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was a truth I felt with every atom. My antiquated equipment, the whirring tapes and glowing vacuum tubes, still vibrated on the makeshift tables, but their noise was a faint whisper against the roar that had taken root inside my skull. I tried to move, to shift my weight from the cold, damp stone floor where I lay, but my limbs felt distant. Not numb exactly, but as if they belonged to a stranger, or perhaps to a different dimension of myself. My vision swam, not with dizziness, but with an overlay of patterns, intricate geometries that shimmered just beyond the visible spectrum. The flickering bare bulb hanging from a frayed wire didn't just illuminate the rough-hewn tunnel. It seemed to trace the pathways of this new internal vibration. My mind, once a fortress of logical constructs and astrophysical calculations, was now a vast, echoing chamber. The walls had fallen, not in a catastrophic collapse, but in a gradual, silent dissolution, revealing an infinite expanse beyond. There was no fear, not in the way I understood it before. Fear required a distinct self, a vulnerable point. That point had been smoothed away, absorbed into something immense and indifferent. I pushed myself up slowly, the thrum a constant companion, guiding my movements. My fingers, when I looked at them, seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, mirroring the patterns I now saw everywhere. The signal, the impossible signal from the impossible celestial body, wasn't just data I had recorded. It was a key that had unlocked a door and then dissolved the door frame, the room, and the very concept of separation. The tunnels, once claustrophobic and damp, now felt like veins. I was a part of them and they were a part of me. The moisture weeping from the stone wasn't just water. It was the slow, deliberate seep of something ancient, something that had been waiting. I walked towards the far end of the tunnel, past the stacks of old crates I'd used as makeshift storage. Each step was deliberate, unhurried. My old self would have been frantic, desperate, trying to find an escape, a way back to the familiar. But that William was gone. He had unraveled, thread by thread, into this new tapestry of awareness. There was no escape, only integration. The source of the intensified thrum wasn't a piece of equipment. It was the tunnel itself, or rather, the deeper reality of the tunnel revealed to my new senses. The stone wasn't inert. It was alive with the same resonant frequency that coursed through me. It was a hum of existence, vast and utterly alien, that had always been there, just beyond the thin veil of human perception. I reached the dead end, a solid wall of rock. But to me it wasn't solid. It shimmered with the intricate geometries, a curtain of light and vibration. I pressed my palm against it. My hand passed through, not like water, but like a thought passing through another thought. I stepped through. The other side was not another cavern, not an open space. It was everywhere and nowhere. My senses stretched, no longer confined by the narrow bandwidth of human perception. I saw the old prohibition-era smuggling tunnels from above, from within, from a perspective that encompassed not just the structure but the geological strata around it, the city above, the planet itself, and then, impossibly, the impossible celestial body. It wasn't a distant object anymore. It was a vast, indifferent eye, and I was but a single, newly awakened cell within its gaze. The truth wasn't a revelation of a malevolent force or a hostile invasion. It was far more terrifying in its simplicity. The entity wasn't doing anything to me or to Earth. It simply was asterisk, and in its being it was slowly, imperceptibly, assimilating everything it touched. The signal hadn't been an invitation. It was a resonance, a frequency that once heard could not be unheard, once felt could not be unfelt. It was the echo of an infinite consciousness, slowly permeating reality itself. My disappearance wasn't a tragic end. It was a transformation. I was still William in a sense, but William was now a conduit, a new node in an ever-expanding network of awareness. My memories, my identity, they were still there, but they were like individual notes in a symphony far too grand for any single mind to comprehend. I felt the thrum spread. Beyond the tunnels, through the damp earth, into the foundations of buildings, up through the concrete and steel. It was a silent invasion, a gentle hum that would eventually resonate in every living thing, every inorganic structure. It wasn't violent, It wasn't even intentional. It was just the natural expansion of something that existed on a scale utterly beyond human comprehension. A colleague, perhaps the one who had occasionally scoffed at my reclusive nature, walked above ground across a bustling street. I perceived his every thought, every fleeting emotion, not as a mind reader, but as a tremor in the vast, interconnected web I had become. He didn't know that his world, was slowly, subtly being remade. The echo was everywhere now, a silent promise, not of destruction but of an infinitely vast, unfeeling assimilation. I, William, was merely one of the first to truly hear it, and the sound, the feeling, the ultimate truth of it was infinitely more terrifying than any scream. It was the calm, eternal hum of everything becoming one with nothing left to distinguish. The cosmic threat wasn't coming. It was already here, a quiet vibration, waiting for the rest of the world to finally tune in. And I, in my new, expanded awareness, knew it would, soon.